Dennis saw the title, today's topic, and said, I got the perfect songs for today. And boy, did he ever, huh? Letting go. That's what we're going to be talking about today. It's week number 4 in our fall series based on the book Finding Yourself in Transition by Robert Brummett. And we're talking about a spiritual approach to dealing with change and transition. And so today, we're moving into the second of our 3 stages of a transition, which is the void or the wilderness. And this is the section in the book where I think Robert does such a wonderful job of demonstrating how we use the Bible in unity. I think unity is unique among contemporary spiritual movements in the way that we look at the Bible. We recognize that for better and sometimes for worse, the Bible is the single most influential collection of books in our Western culture. That's just a fact. It's ancient. The last book of the Bible was written just over 2,000 years ago. The oldest book is maybe around 2,800 or more years old. This is not a modern recreation. These are words written by people over 2,000 years ago, which makes it a remarkable window through which to observe the evolution of human consciousness over time. And even though we embrace the Bible, we don't take it all literally. It wasn't dictated word for word by God. It was written by human beings who were trying to make sense of their world. They're asking the same questions that everyone still asks today. Why are we here? How did we get here? What is the meaning of life? All of those things, they were asking the same questions back then. So when you read those parts of the Bible which kind of describe God as a homicidal maniac, drowning people in floods, incinerating them in fire and brimstone, or turning them into pillars of salt and all sorts of other things, we're learning about the mindset of a Bronze Age tribal culture, not a divine reality. So unity approaches the Bible from a symbolic, allegorical, and historical perspective. And these stories give us some great insight into the state of consciousness of humankind and how we've really changed and grown over the years. So in our book, Robert uses the story of the Exodus as a way of exploring how people deal with change. And one of the lessons that we can learn from a symbolic and allegorical interpretation of the Exodus story is that 2,800 years ago, people had the same challenges that we do today when it comes to change. Growth and change have always been painful and messy. And the alternative to not growing and changing is simply unacceptable. Resisting change, well, that just makes it more painful. Refusing to grow means that we stay stuck in old ways of thinking, which can be like a form of prison, bondage, slavery. So Exodus is a good story to work with. For one reason, because thanks to Cecil B. DeMille and the movie The 10 Commandments, who's seen the movie The 10 Commandments? Just about everyone has seen that movie. Everybody is familiar with the basics of the story. And we know what the main characters are, right? The main characters are Moses, the Israelites, Pharaoh, and Egypt. So we can look at Egypt, that's the place where the Israelites were enslaved, as a place of slavery and bondage where the only reality is survival and physical labor. So Egypt symbolizes a limited state of consciousness because they're only surviving, they're not thriving. So if we're only surviving and not thriving, we're not living up to our full potential as human beings. The Israelites were not living up to their full potential as human beings. So the question arises, how did they get there in the first place? I mean, if this was such a bad place, if they're enslaved and in bondage, why were they there? Well, earlier in the story, we find out that they went to Egypt voluntarily. This was a generation before Moses, a generation or more before Moses. They went there at the invitation of a fellow named Joseph, who you might remember from another contemporary musical. Anybody seen Joseph in the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat? That's the story of Joseph the Dreamer. So Joseph was one of the sons of Jacob, who was the father of the leaders of the 12 tribes of Israel. And Joseph, you might recall, he was sold into slavery by his jealous brothers, and he wound up in Egypt. And Joseph used his ingenuity, his creativity, his wits to rise to a position of great power in Egypt. So when this deadly famine arose in Egypt and all the surrounding land, Joseph was in a position to bring his father and his brothers to Egypt so they wouldn't starve to death. Joseph had the foresight in his position within the Egyptian government to lay aside huge stores of food in case of a famine. So he brought his family to Egypt, and he saved their lives. Joseph literally saved Israel. The heads of what would be the 12 tribes of Israel came to Egypt, and that's where they found enough food to survive. And so it started out, as you can see, as a really good thing. He saved their lives. But as things happen, as the years pass, we might say that the Israelites sort of overstayed their welcome. Ben Franklin, like Joseph, was a very witty guy. And he once said this. He said, "Guests, like fish, begin to smell after 3 days, or 3 decades, or whatever it happened to be." And what happened was Joseph died, and the Israelites no longer had their powerful friend in a high place in the Egyptian government, and so they were in trouble. That's when things began to turn. What had worked in the past and what had served them in the past no longer served them, and now they were literally prisoners of the past. The story says they were slaves to the Egyptians, which means that they were no longer in control of their destiny, and they'd stopped growing. They'd stopped evolving. So it took Moses to lead them out of that state of consciousness. And Moses is another symbol. We can look at Moses as symbolizing our spiritual nature, our consciousness awakened to our true human power and potential. Another way that we like to describe that awakened consciousness and our spiritual nature is the Christ, our Christ nature. So Moses, you might recall from the story, he's the guy that goes off on his own spiritual wilderness journey where he has an encounter with a burning bush. By the way, did you hear the one about what happened when Moses got a phone call from President Bush? Moses refused to talk to him. He said, "The last time I talked to a bush, I ended up lost in the desert for 40 years. He wasn't being rude, it was just, that fear thing. So this particular bush, this burning bush, tells Moses one of the names of God. I am, or I am that I am. The self-existent one, pure being. Moses learns the power of the I am that was at work in and through him. Because Moses, he didn't want to do it. He didn't want to be a leader. And yet he was empowered and inspired by the I am to return and to stand up to and challenge the mighty Pharaoh. So Pharaoh's another symbol. In fact, anytime that we encounter an oppressive ruler or a king in the Bible, be it Pharaoh or later on King Herod, for example, they most commonly symbolize the personal ego. And when it comes to change, the ego is that which tends to want to resist change the most. The ego wants to be in control all the time, and change from the outside is a threat to that control. So that's what causes a lot of problems. Until we discover the power of our inner Moses, our awakened spiritual nature, and let that lead the way, we're going to be most of the time slaves to the ego, which is why change is so difficult for human beings today and going back 2,800, 3,000 years ago. Once we wake up, we start to move forward again, evolve, grow. There might be resistance because the ego never goes away. We don't buy into this silly notion that we can totally stamp out or get rid of the ego. That doesn't happen. That's not healthy. The ego may try to drag us back down again, but as we learn to trust the power within, again, our spiritual nature, the ego gradually loses its grip. It's not in control all of the time. Now, this isn't always an easy or pleasant process. The Exodus story tells about plagues, great suffering that accompanies the process of getting Pharaoh, the ego, to loosen its grip on us. And the message there is that clinging and resistance results in suffering. That was one of the great insights of the Buddha. Our suffering is caused by resistance, attachment, and clinging in the face of impermanence, in the face of pervasive change and transition that's always going on. The root of suffering is attachment. But eventually, in response to the urgings of Moses, Pharaoh, the ego lets go. He relinquishes control. And even though you would think this is a wonderful thing that's finally happening, right? The Israelites are no longer slaves. They're allowing Moses to lead them out of slavery. It's still an ending. And we talked about endings last week. Endings are scary. In this case, there's a familiar way of life that's gone. And now they're venturing into the great unknown. So they leave Egypt and they end up lost in the wilderness. And we know that anytime we have a big change or a loss in life, we're going to go through this wilderness experience. We end up in the void. We feel lost, without resources, vulnerable, unprotected, no more road maps. And the story says that the Israelites spent 40 years in the wilderness. That's not a literal number. In fact, 40 in the Bible is a very interesting number. I suspect in spirit when you're talking about numerology, you're going to get into this. There's all sorts of numbers that are used in the Bible. 7, 12, 40, and there are others, but 7, 12, and 40 are the most common ones. 40 is a symbolic number. You see it used over and over again in the Bible. It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Jesus went off to meditate for 40 days and things like that. It is a symbolic way of saying that it'll take whatever time that it needs to take to complete the process. That's it. It'll take whatever time that it needs to take, which again is just another way of saying, and they got this right all those many years ago, that transition is a process, and we stay in the wilderness for as long as it takes to make sure that we have truly let go of the past and then are ready for the new beginning. Now remember what the Israelites did while they were in the wilderness. They didn't behave very well, did they? No, they whined, they complained. They must have been like kids in the back seat of the car on a long trip, right? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? How come it's taking so long? I'm hungry. I have to go to the bathroom. Anybody have one of those trips when they were a kid? They kept talking about how they wanted to actually go back to Egypt. Let's go back to where we were slaves, because at least we had easy access to food and water and shelter. And out here in the wilderness, we got to do it all for ourselves. They said it would be better to be slaves in Egypt than to die in the wilderness. They were convinced that they were going to die in the wilderness. It felt that uncomfortable. Change can feel that uncomfortable. The wilderness experience can be uncomfortable like that. It's like we were saying though last week, so often we'll stay in a dysfunctional situation because it's familiar. And the dysfunction seems more comfortable than the change. And that's not the consciousness that's going to lead to transformation or a new beginning. As long as we want to go backwards, no transformation and no new beginning. The wilderness is where we learn lots of things. Chief among those things is patience. I would imagine Moses got pretty sick of hearing all the complaining. Leading the Israelites through the wilderness, we have that expression, herding cats. It must have been a lot like herding cats. And the only thing that came from all of their complaining and their resistance and their refusal to follow the lead of Moses was they got to spend more time in the wilderness. See how it works? And yet it was in the wilderness where the most important work was happening. In the wilderness, they learned, finally, how to really follow the guidance of Moses, the higher self, the spiritual nature. In the wilderness, they learned how to work together. They learned how to rely on their own inner power to get what they needed. They came together, united with a common mission and purpose, instead of 12 separate tribes. All of that happened in the wilderness, long before they got to the promised land and the new beginning. That's where the transformation happened. Transformation happens in the wilderness. It's a gradual process before we reach the promised land or the new beginning. So that's why it's so important not to try to force things in the wilderness, not to try to skip a step. We have a concept or a phrase in Unity that we like to use called divine order. You've all heard that, divine order. And it's a saying, I think, that we sometimes throw around a little bit recklessly. Sometimes we use divine order to justify the poor choices that we make when we're not paying attention, when we're asleep, when we're spiritually asleep. Oh gosh, I forgot to file my tax return, but it's all in divine order. I'm sure the IRS will understand once I tell them that. We all know how IRS agents love platitudes, right? Like, divine order, that's really gonna help. Well, that's not what divine order means. Divine order doesn't mean, whatever happens is okay. It's not okay to be asleep. Divine order is the natural and orderly process that we see at work in the universe. Mind, idea, expression is one example. That's the creative process. It goes from mind to idea to expression. You can't skip a step. Change and transition is part of divine order at work. It's inexorable, it's unavoidable, and if we try to skip steps, we cause problems. On the other hand, when we work on letting our awakened self, our Christ nature, lead the way and learn how to trust that when we're stuck in the wilderness, divine order can unfold in ways that we will clearly discern. And when we cooperate with that, then we reach the new beginning. Now, over the centuries, the great contemplative traditions of the world, the meditative traditions of the world, have been focusing on the study of human existence. And they all agree that a part of the human condition, especially when dealing with change, is this thing we've been calling the wilderness experience. The Buddhists, they call it the void. St. John of the Cross called it the dark night of the soul. And in world mythology, it's known as the abyss. So, in just these three traditions here, there's a virtual treasure trove of experience and wisdom from the past that's designed to help us and to inspire us when we're facing the wilderness, when we're going through our wilderness experience. That's going to be our topic for next week. See you then.